In the electric glow of modern civilization, Nikola Tesla stands like a forgotten prophet, the man who gave humanity light, yet spent his final years in shadow, who dreamed of wireless power spanning continents, yet couldn't pay his hotel bill, who single-handedly ushered in the age of electricity, yet died alone and penniless in a New York hotel room, clutching dreams no one would fund. But behind every patent filed, every demonstration that defied belief, and every vision dismissed as madness, there stood not a superhero of science but a man. Fragile, brilliant, and utterly alone. Tesla's inventions form the invisible architecture of the modern world. Alternating current powers every home. His induction motor spins in every appliance. His principles enable wireless communication across the globe. 700 patents bear his name, yet most people cannot name a single one. Billions use his technology daily, and yet his name fades from memory, replaced by Edison, Marconi, and men who built empires on his foundations. The paradox cuts deeper still. The Serbian immigrant who revolutionized electrical engineering died owing $7,000 to a hotel that tolerated him out of pity. The man whose royalty contract would have made him the wealthiest person in history tore it up to save the technology he believed humanity deserved, and humanity rewarded his sacrifice with indifference. This is not just the tale of Tesla's rise to scientific immortality. It's a story of unwavering devotion to an impossible dream, of a man who chose humanity over wealth, solitude over companionship, and vision over sanity, of genius so pure it became its own prison. For nearly 9 decades, Nikola Tesla walked the earth seeing futures others couldn't imagine. Standing waves in the earth, wireless power transmission to every corner of the globe, energy so abundant it would be free. But abundance threatened profit, and profit always wins. His greatest invention was not the alternating current motor, or the Tesla coil or radio. His greatest invention was himself, the prophet, the showman, the man who summoned lightning and spoke to Mars. And that invention, like all his others, was stolen, perfected by other hands, and sold back to a world that had forgotten its creator. So step into the buzzing laboratories and glittering exhibitions of the electric age, into the smoky lecture halls of London and Paris where Tesla made electricity dance, into the windswept hilltops of Colorado where he called down thunder, and into the shabby hotel rooms where genius died feeding pigeons. See it all through the eyes of the one man who could have ruled the world but chose instead to give it away. This is the untold true story of Nikola Tesla, not the myth, but the man. Not the legend, but the loss. Not the triumph, but the tragedy of being right too soon and caring too much about people who would never care back. Born on July 10th, 1856, in the remote mountain village of Smiljan in what would later become Croatia, Nikola Tesla entered the world during a violent midnight storm. Lightning split the sky as the midwife delivered him in the small rectory house perched on a hillside. Between strikes of thunder, she whispered to his mother, Duka, that it was a bad omen. The child born in darkness would bring only darkness. Duka Mandik Tesla, exhausted from labour but sharp as ever, replied firmly, "No, he will be a child of light." The prophecy would prove both right and wrong. Smiljan sat in the shadow of the Velebit Mountains, a village of perhaps 300 souls, where wooden houses clustered around a Serbian Orthodox church, and the air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. Nikola's father, Milutin, served as the village priest, a stern man with a long beard and longer sermons, who had risen from poverty through education and scripture. He wanted the same for his son, salvation through devotion, obedience through prayer. But Duka offered a different inheritance. She was illiterate, never learned to read a single word, yet her mind worked in dimensions her husband's theology couldn't touch. She invented tools for the household, looms that wove faster than any in the region, kitchen implements that solved problems no one else had named. Nikola would watch her hands moving, always moving, creating solutions from scraps of metal and intuition. She taught him that problems were merely puzzles waiting to be solved, that the world bent to those who understood its hidden mechanics. The boy absorbed both legacies, his father's discipline and his mother's inventive fire. But a third force shaped him more powerfully than either parent, his older brother Dane. Dane was everything a Serbian family could hope for, strong, athletic, beloved. The the golden child who would carry the Tesla name to glory. Nikola worshipped him, followed him everywhere, tried desperately to match his brother's effortless grace. In 1861, when Nikola was 5 years old, Dane fell from the family's prized horse. Accounts vary. Some say the animal spooked, others whisper darker causes. The boy died from his injuries, and something in the Tesla household died with him. Milutin and Duka never recovered from the loss. Their grief hung in the rectory like smoke, and young Nikola suddenly found himself living in a dead boy's shadow, expected to become what Dane would have been, haunted by a ghost he could never equal. The pressure manifested strangely. Nikola began experiencing visions, flashes of blinding light that appeared without warning, followed by detailed images so vivid they seemed more real than reality. He could see objects, rotate them in his mind, examine them from every angle, disassemble and reassemble machines without touching them. His memory became photographic. He could recite entire books after reading them once, recall conversations word for word years later, visualize complex mathematical equations as though they floated before his eyes. Locals thought him touched by God, or possibly the devil. He built water wheels in the streams near the village, intricate devices that turned faster than seemed possible. He caught June bugs, tied threads to their legs, and created living motors. He performed calculations in his head that left his teachers stunned and suspicious. How could a child multiply 4-digit numbers instantly without paper? Nikola Tesla grew tall and thin, with piercing blue-grey eyes that seemed to look through objects rather than at them, high cheekbones, angular features, and a nervous energy that never quite settled. He spoke softly but precisely, each word chosen with the care his mother applied to her inventions. The village imagined his future clearly enough. He would follow Milutin into the priesthood, inherit the church, tend to the faithful, guide Smiljan's souls toward salvation just as his father had. Life, however, rarely consults the expectations of small villages. In 1870, at 14 years old, Tesla was sent away to the Higher Real Gymnasium in Karlovac, a school 60 miles north, where mathematics and science replaced prayers and scripture, where the boy who saw visions would encounter something that would consume him utterly: electricity. At the Higher Real Gymnasium in Karlovac, Tesla's mathematics professor wheeled a Gram dynamo into the classroom, a demonstration of modern electrical science. The machine was French, elegant in its own brutish way. The professor turned the crank and the dynamo sparked to life. Brushes scraped against the commutator, throwing off blue-white sparks that crackled and hissed. The smell of ozone filled the room as the device converted mechanical energy into direct current. Students leaned forward, mesmerized. The professor declared it a perfect machine, the pinnacle of electrical engineering. 17-year-old Nikola Tesla stared at the sparking brushes and saw only waste, friction, heat, inefficiency, a machine fighting itself with every rotation. "Surely," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, "there must be a better way. What if the current alternated, eliminating the need for brushes entirely?" The professor's face darkened with irritation. "Mr. Tesla, you propose the impossible. Alternating current cannot produce continuous rotation. It is a theoretical curiosity, nothing more." Tesla fell silent, but something had shifted in his mind. The professor was wrong. He didn't know how yet, but he was certain of it. In 1875, Tesla enrolled at the Austrian Polytechnic Institute in Graz, a prestigious technical school where the sons of merchants and minor nobility studied engineering, physics, and mathematics. His father had finally relented after nearly losing him. The previous year, cholera had swept through Gospic, where Tesla was attending the Higher Real School. Nikola contracted it and spent 9 months hovering between life and death, delirious with fever, barely able to breathe. His father sat by his bedside and watched his remaining son fade. In a moment of desperation, Milutin made a promise. If Nikola survived, he could abandon the priesthood and study engineering, anything to keep him alive. Nikola recovered, slowly, painfully, and when strength returned to his wasted frame, he carried with him his father's reluctant blessing. At Graz, Tesla threw himself into his studies with an intensity that alarmed his professors. He worked from 3 in the morning until 11 at night, 7 days a week without pause. He attended lectures on physics, mathematics, mechanical engineering. He filled notebooks with calculations and theories, earned the highest marks the institute offered. But he also discovered gambling. Cards became an obsession almost as powerful as his studies. He would play through the night, winning and losing fortunes he didn't have. Once he lost all his tuition money and had to beg his mother to send more. She did, without telling his father. By his third year, the combination of overwork and gambling had pushed him to the edge of collapse. He stopped attending classes, disappeared for weeks. His family thought he'd drowned in the Mur River. He'd actually suffered a nervous breakdown and was wandering through villages, trying to piece himself back together. He never completed his degree, but the problem of alternating current never left him. For 6 years it haunted him. He worked in Budapest at the Central Telegraph Office, a minor position filing reports and maintaining equipment. The rotating magnetic field remained just beyond his grasp. He could feel the solution hovering at the edge of consciousness, a shape he couldn't quite see. And then, on an evening in February 1882, everything changed. Tesla was walking through the city park in Budapest with his friend Anita Szigeti. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the paths. Tesla had been reciting passages from Goethe's Faust. The glow retreats, done is the day of toil, it yonder hastes, new fields of life exploring. When suddenly the words caught in his throat. His body went rigid. Szigeti grabbed his arm, thinking Tesla was having a seizure, but Tesla was seeing something else entirely. There, in his mind, complete and perfect, appeared the rotating magnetic field, not as an abstract concept, but as a functioning machine. He could see the stator with its polyphase windings, the rotor spinning without brushes or commutator, driven by magnetic fields that rotated of their own accord. He grabbed a stick and began drawing frantically in the dirt, explaining to a bewildered Szigeti exactly how alternating current could produce continuous rotation. The entire motor system laid out in sand and sunset light. "See how beautiful it is," he said, his voice trembling. "So simple, so elegant. The currents create rotating fields, and the fields turn the rotor. No brushes, no sparks, no friction, just mathematics made physical." He had solved it. 6 years of obsession, crystallized in a single moment. Tesla spent the next months refining the vision in his mind, building and rebuilding the motor without touching a single piece of metal, rotating it, examining it, perfecting it. By the time he was ready to construct a physical prototype, every detail existed complete in his memory. The problem was simple and absolute. Seeing and building are different things. Vision requires only imagination, but construction requires something Tesla didn't have: money, tools, access to workshops, and most critically, someone willing to bet on a 26-year-old Serbian with no degree claiming to have revolutionized electrical engineering through pure thought. Tesla needed a patron, a believer, someone who understood that the future had already been invented. It just needed funding. Tesla arrived in the New World on June 6, 1884. The steamship docked at the Battery and discharged its cargo of immigrants into Manhattan's sweltering summer heat. Somewhere between the gangplank and the customs house, thieves relieved him of his luggage. Everything he owned vanished into the New York crowds. He emerged onto American soil with 4 cents in his pocket, a book of Serbian poetry, and one crumpled letter. The letter was from Charles Batchelor, his former employer at Continental Edison in Paris. It was addressed to Thomas Alva Edison, and it read simply, "I know 2 great men, and you are one of them. The other is this young man." Tesla stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, impossibly thin, dressed in a borrowed suit that hung loose on his angular frame. He spoke almost no English and knew no one, but he had the letter, and he had the vision of his alternating current motor burning in his mind like a banked fire. He found Edison at the Pearl Street station in Lower Manhattan, the heart of Edison's direct current empire. The building hummed with dynamos and reeked of machine oil and ambition. Edison stood amid the machinery, short, stocky, perpetually in motion, his clothes rumpled, his hands stained with grease. He read Batchelor's letter, squinted at the gaunt Serbian and grunted. "So you think you know something about electricity?" "Yes," Tesla replied in halting English. "I have solved the problem of alternating current." Edison waved the words away like smoke. Alternating current is dangerous, wasteful, a dead end. Direct current is the future. My system is the future. But he hired Tesla anyway. Perhaps he saw something in those intense blue-grey eyes, or perhaps he simply needed another pair of hands. The contrast between them was total. Edison worked by trial and error, building, testing, discarding, rebuilding. He would try 10,000 combinations to find one that worked. His laboratory was chaos barely controlled. Assistants scrambling, parts everywhere, cigar smoke and shouted orders. Tesla worked through pure mathematics. He designed entire systems in his head, perfected them through calculation, and only then built the finished device. Edison trusted his hands. Tesla trusted his mind. Edison built an empire on patents and publicity. Tesla dreamed of giving humanity free power. They were not colleagues. They were opposing philosophies forced into the same room. For 18 months, Tesla worked on improving Edison's dynamos, the direct current generators that powered New York's growing electrical grid. He redesigned them, made them more efficient, more reliable, more profitable. Edison watched the improvements accumulate. One evening he made Tesla an offer, or perhaps it was a promise. The stories vary. "There's $50,000 in it for you if you can redesign my motors and generators, make them more efficient." Tesla agreed without hesitation. For a year he worked obsessively, redesigning 24 different types of Edison machines. He created new regulators, transformers, improved the commutators, reduced sparking and waste. When he finished, he presented Edison with a complete overhaul of the entire system, motors that ran smoother, used less fuel, and broke down less frequently. Edison's company would save a fortune. Tesla asked for his $50,000. Edison laughed. "Tesla, you don't understand our American humor." The words landed like a physical blow. Tesla stared at him, unable or unwilling to believe what he'd heard. This was not humor. This was theft dressed up as jest. "I offered you $18 a week, and you've been getting it. That should be enough for someone like you." Tesla resigned that night. He walked out of the Pearl Street station with nothing. No patents in his name, no money, no prospects. Just the bitter knowledge that the most famous inventor in America was also a liar and a thief. For the next year, Tesla discovered what poverty in New York actually meant. He took work where he could find it, digging ditches for $2 a day, wielding a shovel alongside Irish and Italian labourers who didn't know that the gaunt Serbian working beside them had invented the future. The cruelest irony came when he realised what he was digging. Trenches for Edison's electrical conduits, the direct current system he knew was inferior, the wires that would carry electricity through lower Manhattan based on technology he could have replaced with something better. Tesla stood in a muddy trench on a spring morning in 1886, water seeping through his boots, back aching from the shovel work. 6 feet above him, men in silk hats and fine coats walked past, discussing business, appointments, theatre plans, discussing the miracle of Edison's electric lights. Those lights ran on the very system Tesla had helped perfect and then been cheated for improving. He leaned on his shovel and looked up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the buildings. Somewhere up there, his alternating current motor waited, complete and perfect, existing in a dimension only he could see. All he needed was another chance, someone who wouldn't steal his work, someone who understood that genius could wear muddy boots and still be genius. On April 6, 1887, 2 men walked into a Manhattan patent attorney's office with a proposition for the gaunt Serbian engineer they'd been watching. Alfred S. Brown was a superintendent at Western Union Telegraph Company, a practical man who understood infrastructure and investment. Charles F. Peck was a lawyer from Englewood, New Jersey, who specialized in turning technical innovations into profitable ventures. They'd heard about Tesla through the small world of New York electrical engineers, whispers about a man with a photographic memory, and revolutionary ideas about alternating current, a genius currently digging ditches because Edison had betrayed him. Their offer was simple. "We'll provide the laboratory, the equipment, and the funding. You provide the inventions. We split everything equally, 1/3 each." Tesla stared at them, searching for the trap, the hidden clause, the American humor. There was none. By the end of April, the Tesla Electric Company had been formed, and Tesla had a laboratory at 89 Liberty Street in Lower Manhattan. The space wasn't large, a single floor in a brick building that smelled of sawdust and metal, but it was his. Brown and Peck furnished it with lathes, drill presses, measuring instruments, coils of copper wire, sheets of iron. Everything Tesla's mind had been designing for 5 years with nothing but imagination. Now he could build. Tesla worked with the feverish intensity of a man making up for lost time. He arrived at the laboratory before dawn and left long after midnight. Often he forgot to eat. His assistants would find him standing motionless in the centre of the room, staring at nothing, his eyes tracking invisible patterns in the air. Then suddenly he would move, barking instructions in his accented English, pointing to precise measurements, demanding specific thicknesses of wire. His hands moved constantly, shaping the motor in the air before they shaped it in metal. The design was elegant, almost absurdly simple once you understood it. No brushes, no commutator, no parts that rubbed together and wore out. Just copper coils arranged around a central rotor. When alternating current flowed through the coils in the proper sequence, the magnetic fields they created would rotate, and the rotor would spin without anything touching it. It was electromagnetism made visible, mathematics transformed into motion. By October of 1887, the first working prototype was complete. A small device no larger than a bread box. Tesla connected it to an alternating current source and threw the switch. The rotor began to spin, silently, steadily, accelerating to full speed in seconds. No sparks, no grinding, no friction. Just pure rotation driven by invisible fields. Brown and Peck watched in stunned silence. Peck, who'd financed dozens of inventions, had never seen anything like it. "It works," he said unnecessarily. "Of course," Tesla replied, as though any other outcome was inconceivable. Between October 1887 and February 1888, Tesla filed 7 core patents: the induction motor, the alternating current generator, the transformer, the transmission system. Each one a piece of a complete electrical infrastructure. Not just a motor, but an entire civilization powered by alternating current. Patent number 381-968, filed on October 12, 1887, was the foundation. A new and useful improvement in electrical motors. The language was bureaucratic, but the implications were revolutionary. On May 16, 1888, Tesla stood before the American Institute of Electrical Engineers in a lecture hall at Columbia College. The room was packed with every major figure in American electrical engineering: professors, industrialists, Edison's people. They'd come to see the Serbian upstart demonstrate his alternating current system, or more likely, to watch him fail. Tesla began with theory, explaining polyphase currents, rotating magnetic fields, the mathematics of alternating systems. Some in the audience understood immediately. Others looked skeptical. Then he demonstrated. He placed a copper egg on a table connected to his motor. When he energized the system, the egg began to spin, faster and faster until it stood upright on its pointed end, rotating so rapidly it appeared motionless. The Egg of Columbus, he called it, referring to the legend of Columbus making an egg stand on end. The audience erupted. Engineers rushed forward to examine the device, to verify there were no hidden wires, no tricks, just alternating current and elegant physics. Among those watching was a reporter for Electrical World magazine, who would write about the demonstration in terms usually reserved for religious experiences. Word spread through New York's electrical community within days, and within weeks it reached Pittsburgh. George Westinghouse read about Tesla's motor with intense interest. Westinghouse had made his fortune on railroad air brakes, but he'd been investing heavily in electrical systems, trying to compete with Edison's direct current monopoly. He knew Edison's system had fundamental limitations. Direct current couldn't be transmitted more than a mile without massive power loss. You needed a generating station every few blocks. Expensive, dangerous, impractical for anything beyond dense urban centres. Alternating current could travel hundreds of miles, but without a practical motor it was useless for industrial applications. Tesla's induction motor solved everything. In July of 1888, Westinghouse came to New York, a tall man with a commanding presence and a reputation for treating inventors fairly. He visited Tesla's laboratory, examined the motor, asked penetrating questions. Tesla answered with the precision of a man who'd thought through every possible objection. By the end of the day, they'd agreed to terms. Westinghouse would pay $60,000 for the patents, plus a royalty of $2.50 for every horsepower of Tesla current sold. It was a fortune, potentially the foundation of eternal wealth. If alternating current took over the electrical industry, and both men believed it would, Tesla would become one of the richest men in the world. Westinghouse asked Tesla to come to Pittsburgh to work with his engineers to help them implement the system on an industrial scale. Tesla agreed reluctantly. He preferred the freedom of his own laboratory to the structure of a corporation, but this was the path to changing the world. In Pittsburgh, the culture clash was immediate and total. Westinghouse's engineers were practical men who worked with slide rules and prototypes. They built things, tested them, adjusted them, built them again. Tesla designed complete systems in his head and expected them to work perfectly the first time. The engineers thought he was arrogant. Tesla thought they were slow, but the motor worked beyond anyone's expectations. In test after test, it proved itself more efficient, more reliable, more elegant than anything direct current could offer. Westinghouse began installing Tesla's system in factories across Pennsylvania. The hum of induction motors replaced the spark and grind of DC machines. Edison's empire suddenly looked fragile, built on a foundation that mathematics had already rendered obsolete. The motor that Tesla had seen complete in a Budapest park 6 years earlier now spun in workshops and factories, doing exactly what geometry and physics demanded. No brushes wearing down, no commutators sparking. Just rotating magnetic fields performing their silent, inevitable work. Edison's direct current empire still dominated New York, but the siege had begun, and Westinghouse, armed with Tesla's weapon, was ready to wage war. Thomas Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, did not build his empire by yielding to superior technology. He built it through spectacle, propaganda, and when necessary, terror. In December 1888, Edison's laboratory at West Orange, New Jersey, became something darker than a place of invention. It became a theatre of death. Edison, determined to prove that alternating current was lethal, hired an electrician named Harold Brown. Together they began electrocuting animals in public demonstrations. Dogs were the primary victims, purchased from shelters or caught as strays. Brown would wire them to electrodes, explain the dangers of the Tesla-Westinghouse system, and then throw the switch. The dogs convulsed, shrieked, and died while audiences watched in horror. Edison filmed these executions, distributed the footage to newspapers, and called it a public service. He was warning America about the dangers of alternating current, protecting the innocent from Westinghouse's deadly technology. The campaign was methodical and vicious. Edison coined a new verb. To Westinghouse, someone meant to kill them by electrocution. Newspapers picked up the term, ran with it. Suddenly every article about alternating current carried the implicit threat of death. In 1889, the state of New York decided to replace hanging with a more modern form of execution, the electric chair. Edison immediately lobbied for the device to use alternating current. If the state killed criminals with AC, he reasoned, the public would associate the technology with death. Westinghouse fought back, tried to block the sale of AC generators for execution, but Edison's people acquired them through intermediaries. On August 6, 1890, William Kemmler became the first person executed by electrocution at Auburn Prison in upstate New York. The execution was meant to be quick, humane, proof that AC delivered instant death. It was a nightmare. The first jolt of 1,000 volts lasted 17 seconds. Kemmler's body convulsed, then went limp. The doctor pronounced him dead. Then someone noticed he was still breathing. The generator was recharged. They hit him with 2,000 volts for over a minute. The smell of burning flesh filled the execution chamber. Kemmler's blood vessels ruptured. His body caught fire. Witnesses vomited or fled the room. The whole ordeal took 8 minutes. Newspapers called it an abomination, far worse than hanging. But Edison's publicity machine spun the disaster as proof of alternating current's dangers. See how deadly Westinghouse's system is? It can burn a man alive. The public was horrified, but not in the way Edison intended. People saw not the danger of AC, but the cruelty of a man willing to burn a human being to protect his patents. Westinghouse was furious. They could have done better with an axe, he told reporters. He launched a counter-campaign, explaining the real difference between AC and DC, publishing technical articles, buying newspaper advertisements, demonstrating that alternating current, used properly, was perfectly safe. Tesla joined the fight in his own way. At demonstrations and lectures, he passed alternating current through his own body, holding glowing phosphorescent tubes that lit up from the current flowing through him, showing audiences that AC at the right voltage and frequency was harmless. He made electricity dance, transformed it from a threatening invisible force into something beautiful, controllable. But the real battle wasn't being fought in newspapers or lecture halls. It was being fought in city councils and corporate boardrooms as the contracts for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago came up for bid. The fair was to be the largest electrical lighting display in history, a gleaming white city that would showcase America's technological supremacy. Edison bid for the contract, offering to light the entire exposition with direct current. His price was over $5 million. Westinghouse, using Tesla's alternating current system, bid less than $400,000. The difference was stark and simple. DC required a generating station every few blocks, massive amounts, of copper wire and constant maintenance. AC could transmit power from distant generators using thinner, cheaper wire, and Tesla's induction motors meant no more sparking brushes to replace. The World's Fair Commission didn't care about Edison's reputation or his scare tactics about killer current. They cared about budget. In October 1892, Westinghouse won the contract. Edison's propaganda had failed. Mathematics had defeated fear. The execution of William Kemmler was meant to be Edison's triumph, proof that alternating current belonged only in prison death chambers. Instead, it became his defeat. The public saw not the danger of AC, but the lengths one man would go to destroy his competition. When the Chicago Fair opened on May 1, 1893, and President Grover Cleveland pressed a button that illuminated 250,000 lights, all powered by Tesla's alternating current system, the war of currents was over. Alternating current had won, not through propaganda or spectacle, but through simple economic and technical superiority. Edison's empire, built on direct current, didn't collapse immediately. Empires rarely do. But the foundation had cracked, and Westinghouse, with Tesla's system, now began wiring America, city by city, factory by factory, proving what Tesla had seen complete in his mind 11 years earlier. That elegant mathematics, deployed properly, could illuminate the world. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 sprawled across 600 acres of Chicago lakefront. 27 million visitors walked through its gates between May and October, more people than had attended any event in human history. They called it the White City for the neoclassical buildings that gleamed in the sun, all of them illuminated at night by 250,000 electric lights powered entirely by alternating current. Every bulb, every arc lamp, every glowing fountain was a vindication of Tesla's vision. Yet Tesla himself barely attended. He gave a few demonstrations at the fair's electrical building, showed audiences his rotating magnetic field made visible with a copper egg that spun on its point, held tubes of phosphorescent gas that glowed without wires when he stood between electrified plates. The crowds gathered 3 and 4 deep, pressing forward to see the magician of electricity. Newspapers called him a sorcerer, a wizard, someone who'd unlocked nature's deepest secrets. He accepted the praise with a distant courtesy. His mind was already elsewhere. The fair proved alternating current could power civilization, but Tesla had moved beyond proof. He was thinking about transmission, about sending power through the earth itself without wires, about making electricity as freely available as air. Niagara Falls had been thundering long before humans arrived to name it. 6 million cubic feet of water per minute plunging 167 feet, generating enough raw power to light half the continent, if anyone could figure out how to capture it. For decades, engineers had tried. Water wheels, generators, crude attempts that barely scratched the surface. The International Niagara Commission, formed in 1890 to find a solution, opened the competition to every electrical system in the world. Edison proposed a direct current system that would have required miles of thick copper cable and massive generating stations every few blocks between Niagara and Buffalo. The cost would have been astronomical. Westinghouse proposed Tesla's alternating current, generators at the fulls, transformers to step up the voltage for transmission, then step it down again in Buffalo 26 miles away. Simple, elegant, mathematically sound. In October 1893, while the World's Fair was still drawing crowds, Westinghouse won the Niagara contract. 3 massive generators, each producing 5,000 horsepower, all based on Tesla's polyphase system. Construction began immediately, drilling through bedrock, building the powerhouse, installing the enormous turbines and generators. Tesla visited the site once, stood at the edge of the falls, and watched the water that had been falling since before human memory about to become the foundation of the electrical age. On November 16, 1896, the first power flowed from Niagara Falls to Buffalo. Alternating current at 2,200 volts, stepped up to 11,000 for transmission, then stepped down again to power factories, streetlights, and homes. Not a single spark, not a single failure. The system worked exactly as Tesla had envisioned it 14 years earlier in a Budapest park at sunset. Niagara, the natural wonder that had awed humanity for millennia, was now harnessed. Industrial civilization could run on the patient falling of water, guided through copper coils and mathematical principles to emerge as light and motion in cities miles away. Tesla's alternating current system now powered the modern world. The royalty contract he'd signed with Westinghouse in 1888 entitled him to $2.50 for every horsepower of electricity generated using his patents. By conservative estimates, this would eventually make him the wealthiest man alive, tens of millions of dollars, compounding year after year as his system spread across America and then the world. He would never have to worry about funding again, could build anything he imagined, prove every theory, finance every experiment. The future was his. Except that in 1897, Westinghouse's company faced financial crisis, a panic in the markets, a squeeze on credit, creditors demanding immediate payment, and the Tesla royalties suddenly looked less like fair compensation and more like an anchor dragging the company under. Westinghouse came to Tesla with a problem that would change everything. Nikola Tesla sat across from George Westinghouse in a Pittsburgh office, holding the contract that guaranteed his fortune. The royalty agreement signed in 1888 promised $2.50 for every horsepower of alternating current produced. Niagara Falls alone was generating thousands of horsepower daily. As the system spread to cities, factories, and homes across America, the royalties would compound. Conservative estimates put Tesla's eventual wealth at $12 million annually, possibly more, possibly enough to make him the richest man in human history. On the desk between them lay a new contract, a flat payment of $216,000. No royalties, no percentage, no compounding wealth, just a single check, and the end of his claim to the fortune alternating current would generate. Westinghouse didn't try to hide the desperation in his voice. The panic of 1896 had devastated the financial markets. Credit had vanished overnight. Investors were demanding immediate returns. The company was hemorrhaging money, and the royalty payments that had seemed reasonable in 1888 now looked like a death sentence. "If we pay you what you're owed, the company fails," Westinghouse said quietly. "If the company fails, Edison wins. The bankers will force us to sell everything to his people, and your alternating current system dies with us. They'll go back to direct current because Edison controls the patents, the infrastructure, the politics. Everything you've built, everything you've proven, will be dismantled." Tesla listened without expression. He'd spent years in poverty, digging ditches, eating irregular meals, sleeping in laboratories because he couldn't afford a room. He'd watched Edison steal his work, watched lesser men claim credit for his inventions, watched the world use his patents while he struggled for funding. Now, finally, he held the key to eternal financial security, the guarantee that he'd never again have to beg for money to build his dreams. All he had to do was enforce the contract he'd signed 9 years earlier. Westinghouse wasn't begging exactly. He was simply stating facts. The choice was Tesla's alone. Fortune or principle, security or vision, the wealth to fund every future experiment, or the survival of the technology he'd bled to create. Tesla picked up the royalty contract, looked at it for a long moment, then tore it in half. "You have been my friend, Westinghouse," he said. You believed in me when others refused. You have stood by my alternating current system when everyone said it would fail. The benefits that will come to civilization from my polyphase system mean more to me than the money involved." He signed the new contract. $216,000 as full payment. No royalties, no percentage, no future claims. Westinghouse tried to argue, tried to find some compromise, but Tesla had made his decision with the same finality he applied to mathematics. The equation was solved. Money was simply a tool, and tools could always be found. What mattered was the work, the survival of AC current, the electrification of civilization, his future inventions, which would surely be even more revolutionary. He walked out of that office having given away hundreds of millions of dollars, convinced he'd made the only rational choice, convinced that money would come when the next great invention arrived, convinced that the world would reward genius eventually, if not through royalties, then through some other mechanism. He was 41 years old, and he'd just thrown away his only chance at financial independence. Within 2 years, he would be chasing funding again, begging investors for money to build laboratories, watching his bank account drain as he pursued visions no one else could see. The decision that seemed noble in 1897 would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because he regretted it, but because it established a pattern he could never break. Tesla would always choose vision over profit, always sacrifice security for the work, always believe that the next invention would solve his financial problems, and the next invention would always cost more than he had. He'd built his own prison, and the bars were made of principle, but in the moment, walking out into the Pittsburgh afternoon, he felt only relief. Alternating current would survive. Westinghouse would weather the crisis, and Tesla was free to pursue the dream that had been growing in his mind since Colorado, since Niagara, since the beginning. Wireless transmission of power, electricity sent through the Earth itself, available anywhere to anyone, free as sunlight. All he needed was funding. Just one more investor, one more laboratory, one more chance to prove the impossible. On May 18th, 1899, Nikola Tesla stepped off the train in Colorado Springs, a frontier town 7,000 feet above sea level, where the air was thin and crackling with electricity. The lightning storms that rolled across the plains were legendary, brilliant, violent, and perfect for what Tesla had in mind. He'd secured funding from John Jacob Astor, the wealthiest man in America, $30,000 to prove that the Earth itself could conduct electricity. That power could be transmitted wirelessly across continents, that Niagara Falls could light Tokyo without a single wire. The locals thought he was insane. They gave him land on a barren hilltop on the outskirts of town and free electricity from the Colorado Springs Electric Company in exchange for improvements to their generators. Tesla designed a laboratory that looked like a barn, walls of raw planks, a roof that could roll back to expose the interior to the sky, and in the center, a wooden tower rising 200 feet, crowned with a copper sphere 3 feet in diameter. It wasn't a laboratory. It was a temple to lightning. Inside, Tesla built what he called a magnifying transmitter, a massive coil 52 feet in diameter, wound with 76 turns of copper wire. When energized, this coil would generate voltages in the millions, and if his calculations were correct, it would send standing waves through the Earth itself, proving that the planet could carry electrical current from pole to pole. Construction took months. Tesla drove his assistants relentlessly, demanding precision to the millimeter, specific thicknesses of wire, exact spacing between coils. He worked through the thin mountain air that left other men gasping, barely eating, sleeping only a few hours each night. By December, the system was ready. On the evening of December 13th, 1899, Tesla stood in the doorway of the laboratory. His assistant, Coleman Cito, stood at the controls inside. "Throw the switch," Tesla ordered. Cito hesitated. The coil hummed with a lethal voltage. The copper sphere atop the tower pulsed with contained energy. This could destroy the building, kill anyone nearby, or prove that Tesla was the greatest electrical genius who ever lived. Cito threw the switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then lightning erupted. Not from the clouds, but from the tower itself. Bolts of electricity arcing 135 feet into the night sky, crackling and snapping like artillery fire. The smell of ozone filled the air. Thunder rolled across the plains. artificial thunder created by human hands. Inside the laboratory, everything metal glowed with St. Elmo's fire. The wooden walls sparked. The ground beneath Tesla's feet tingled with current. He stood calmly in the doorway, making notes, observing the play of forces he'd summoned. The lightning was visible for miles. Ranchers rode in the next day to ask what the hell was happening on that hilltop. Had Tesla opened a door to hell, or was he trying to compete with God? Neither, Tesla replied. I'm simply doing electrical experiments. The system worked beyond his expectations, but it also blew out the Colorado Springs power station. The generator couldn't handle the massive draw of Tesla's coil, plunging the entire town into darkness. The power company was not amused. Tesla had to rebuild their generator at his own expense, eating into Asta's funding. But he'd proven his point. He'd created the largest electrical oscillations ever generated by human means. Lightning on demand, controllable, directed, artificial. The famous photograph shows Tesla sitting calmly in a chair, reading by lamplight while lightning crashes around him. It's a double exposure. The lightning captured in one shot, Tesla added later. But the myth it created was perfect. The magician of electricity commanding the storm. Yet even as Tesla celebrated his success, something stranger was happening. In July of 1899, while monitoring electrical disturbances in the atmosphere, Tesla began detecting signals, rhythmic patterns, 1, 2, 3, repeated at regular intervals. Too regular to be natural. These weren't random static or interference from his own equipment. They were organized, deliberate, intelligent. Tesla became convinced he was receiving transmissions from extraterrestrial civilizations, possibly from Mars. He announced this to the press. They responded with mockery. "Tesla talks to Martians," screamed the headlines. The genius had finally gone mad, standing alone on a Colorado hilltop, claiming to hear voices from space. Even his supporters were embarrassed. What he'd actually detected were probably natural radio emissions from Jupiter, or possibly Marconi's early radio experiments on the other side of the Atlantic. But Tesla insisted the signals were artificial, were messages, and that humanity's first contact with alien intelligence had happened in his laboratory. The ridicule was immediate and lasting. Tesla, the brilliant inventor, became Tesla the eccentric, Tesla the crank who thought Martians were trying to cool him. His reputation for genius began to shade into reputation for madness. Meanwhile, the money was running out. Asta's $30,000 had been consumed by equipment, construction, and the power station repairs. Tesla mortgaged everything, poured in his own funds, but by January 1900 he could no longer pay his bills. Creditors seized his equipment. The Colorado Springs Electric Company cut his power. Tesla was forced to leave Colorado, abandoning the laboratory and $10,000 in unpaid debts. He departed on January 7, 1900, looking back at the tower as the train pulled away. He'd proven that wireless transmission of power was possible, had sent electrical waves through the earth and detected them miles away, had created lightning that could be seen across 3 counties. But he left behind only debts and a reputation for talking to planets. The locals dismantled the laboratory for scrap, salvaging the copper wire and leaving the tower as a skeleton, a monument to ambition that outran its budget. Tesla returned to New York with notebooks full of data and a vision more grandiose than anything he'd attempted before. He would build a transmission station powerful enough to send messages and power around the entire world. Wardenclyffe, he would call it, his masterpiece. All he needed was someone willing to fund it, someone who understood that the future required investment in the impossible. He knew exactly where to find that someone: John Pierpont Morgan, the most powerful financier in America, the man who could make empires rise or fall with a telegram. Tesla composed his letter carefully, promising Morgan a world system for wireless transmission. Morgan heard something different. He heard profit, and that misunderstanding would destroy them both. In March 1901, Nikola Tesla purchased 200 acres on the north shore of Long Island in a hamlet called Wardenclyffe, a name that would become synonymous with genius and catastrophic failure. On this flat scrubland overlooking Long Island Sound, he would build his masterpiece, a transmission tower 187 feet tall, topped with a 55-ton mushroom dome, designed to send power and information wirelessly to every corner of the Earth. He told J.P. Morgan it would be a wireless telegraph system to compete with Marconi's transatlantic communications. What he actually intended was far more radical: free electricity for all humanity. Morgan agreed to invest $150,000, less than half of what Tesla actually needed, but it was enough to begin. The contract was signed in March, the land purchased by April. Construction started immediately. Tesla hired Stanford White, the most celebrated architect in America, to design the tower and laboratory complex. White created something that looked like a cathedral to the future. The central tower rose from a brick powerhouse, its wooden frame supporting a dome of copper sheets. The design was elegant, almost organic, like a mushroom or a tree. Beneath the tower, Tesla planned an underground network, iron pipes driven 300 feet into the earth, creating a massive ground connection, tunnels radiating outward like roots. The entire structure would act as a resonator, vibrating at frequencies that would make the earth itself conduct electricity. Morgan thought he was funding a telegraph station, a way to send wireless messages across the Atlantic before Marconi dominated the market. Tesla never quite corrected this misunderstanding. He needed the money too desperately to risk losing it with the truth, that he intended to make electrical power as freely available as sunlight, that his system would eliminate the need for power lines, meters, utility companies, that it would render Morgan's electrical investments worthless. Construction consumed money at a terrifying rate. The tower alone cost over $200,000, the underground pipes and tunnels another $100,000. Specialized equipment from Europe, salaries for engineers and workers, Stanford White's architectural fees. By summer of 1901, Tesla had burned through Morgan's entire investment, and the tower stood only half complete. Then, on December 12, 1901, disaster struck, not at Wardenclyffe, but across the Atlantic. Guglielmo Marconi successfully transmitted the first wireless telegraph signal from England to Newfoundland, 3 clicks representing the letter S, travelling 2,000 miles without wires. The newspapers erupted with celebration. Marconi had conquered the Atlantic. Wireless communication was now a proven reality. Morgan read the headlines and immediately understood. He'd invested in Tesla to beat Marconi to the wireless telegraph, but Marconi had already won. There was no profit in being second, no point in funding a system that would arrive after the market had closed. Tesla tried to salvage the situation. He wrote to Morgan explaining frantically that Wardenclyffe wasn't about telegraphy. It was about power transmission, about a world system that would make electricity universally available, about changing human civilization. Morgan's response was cold and final. "I have received your letter, and in reply would say that I should not feel disposed at present to make any further advances." The message was clear. Morgan had bet on a horse race, and his horse had lost. He saw no reason to keep paying. Tesla begged, wrote letter after letter explaining the revolutionary nature of his system, explaining that Marconi was using 17 of his patents anyway, that the real prize wasn't wireless telegraphy but wireless power, that Wardenclyffe would transform human existence. Morgan's secretaries stopped responding. The financier had moved on. Tesla mortgaged his property, took out loans from anyone who would lend, poured every dollar he had into completing the tower. Work continued sporadically through 1902 and 1903, but without sustained funding, construction kept stopping. Workers went unpaid, materials sat undelivered, creditors began circling. By 1904, the tower stood incomplete. The dome was finished, the framework solid, but the underground system remained unfinished, the equipment only partially installed. Tesla still believed he could find funding, still wrote proposals to wealthy men explaining his vision, still believed that someone would understand, that someone would see beyond the immediate profit to the future he was trying to build. No one did. In 1905, construction stopped entirely. The workers dispersed, the creditors seized what they could, and the tower stood alone on the Long Island shore. 187 feet of abandoned ambition, visible for miles across the flat landscape, a monument not to vision, but to the impossibility of giving humanity something for free, because free power meant no profit, no meters, no bills, no control. And men like Morgan didn't invest in freedom, they invested in monopoly. Tesla still owned the property, technically, though he'd mortgaged it so heavily he owned only the debt. He couldn't bear to visit. couldn't stand to see his masterpiece incomplete, standing against the sky like an accusation. The local children called it Tesla's folly. The farmers whose land surrounded it wondered when someone would tear it down. Visitors from the city would drive out to see it, the famous tower where the mad scientist had tried to talk to Mars or give away electricity, or whatever the newspapers claimed this week. Tesla kept his laboratory in New York, kept filing patents and giving interviews, claiming Wardenclyffe would be completed soon, that funding was imminent, that the system would work perfectly once finished. But the tower stood empty, year after year, collecting rust and bird nests, while the man who designed it descended into poverty, moving from hotel to hotel, one step ahead of unpaid bills. The vision he'd seen complete in his mind, the world system that would revolutionize human civilization, remained trapped on Long Island, incomplete, unfunded, a skeleton of copper and wood slowly weathering into failure. The tower that should have been his coronation became instead his gravestone, erected years before he died, marking the spot where genius collided with capitalism, and capitalism won. Because no matter how elegant the mathematics, no matter how sound the physics, no matter how revolutionary the vision, a system that gives away what could be sold has no place in a world ruled by ledgers. Tesla had built heaven, but heaven doesn't generate quarterly returns, and so heaven remained unfinished, slowly collapsing under its own impossible weight, visible for miles, a reminder to every inventor who followed that changing the world requires more than being right. It requires finding someone willing to profit from your righteousness, and if your righteousness eliminates profit, you will build alone and die alone, and leave behind only monuments to what might have been. Every day at precisely the same hour, Nikola Tesla emerged from whichever Manhattan hotel would still harbour him, walked 17 blocks following a route he'd calculated to be divisible by 3, and arrived at Bryant Park behind the New York Public Library. There he performed the ritual that had become his sole source of comfort. He fed the pigeons. Not casually, but systematically, with seed he could barely afford, talking to them in Serbian and English, calling them by names only he knew. He had favourites, especially one, a white pigeon with grey-tipped wings. The only living creature he would ever admit to loving. Tesla's life had contracted to obsessions. He washed his hands constantly, scrubbing until the skin cracked and bled. He counted his steps in multiples of 3. He calculated the cubic volume of every soup bowl before he could eat. He refused to touch anything round. He couldn't look at pearls. The sight of them filled him with inexplicable revulsion. If a woman wore pearl earrings, he would leave the room. At hotels, he demanded room numbers divisible by 3, insisted on exactly 18 napkins at dinner, polished each piece of silverware with those 18 napkins before using it. The staff thought him mad, but he tipped well when he could pay at all, so they tolerated his rituals, brought him the napkins, gave him the rooms he demanded, and pretended not to notice when he moved in the middle of the night, one step ahead of the unpaid bill. The pigeons didn't judge, didn't demand payment, didn't care that his clothes were worn or that he owed money across Manhattan. They simply came when he called, landed on his shoulders and arms, ate from his hands. The white pigeon was special. She would fly to his hotel window late at night, tap on the glass until he let her in. He would feed her, nurse her if she was injured, talk to her for hours about his inventions, the ones he'd built and the ones still trapped in his mind. "I loved that pigeon," he told a reporter years later, "as a man loves a woman, and she loved me." When people heard this, they heard the confession of a lunatic, an old man who'd confused a bird with a wife. But Tesla meant something different. The pigeon was the only creature who had never betrayed him, never stolen his patents, never refused funding, never demanded he compromise his vision for profit. She came to him freely, expected nothing, and gave him the only thing he needed, companionship without complication. His reputation had shifted from genius to curiosity to cautionary tale. Young engineers would visit him occasionally, not to learn but to see the famous Tesla, the man who'd once lit the World's Fair, who'd harnessed Niagara, who now lived in hotel rooms feeding birds. He still gave interviews on his birthdays. The newspapers loved him for the wild claims he'd make. Death rays that could destroy armies at 200 miles, machines that could split the Earth in half, particle beams that would end all wars, wireless power systems ready to deploy if someone would just fund them. The reporters scribbled it all down, printed it with barely concealed mockery. The aging inventor's fantasies, the delusions of a man who'd outlived his relevance. What they didn't know, what no one knew until decades later, was that most of his claims were theoretically sound. The particle beam weapon would eventually be called radar. His wireless power transmission would become the foundation of modern radio and telecommunications. His earthquake machine was based on resonance principles that would later be used to demolish buildings. He wasn't mad. He was simply describing a future no one else could see, talking to people who lacked the mathematics to understand him. The white pigeon died in 1926. She flew into his hotel window one final night, and Tesla knew immediately something was wrong. She was glowing, he said later. A powerful beam of light came from her eyes, brighter than anything I'd produced in my laboratory. She had come to tell me goodbye. He held her as she died, this creature who'd been his companion through the worst years, who'd never asked anything of him, who'd loved him as purely as he'd loved his alternating current system. When she died, he wrote, something in Tesla died with her. I knew my life's work was finished. Whatever I had accomplished was done. All that I had hoped to do in the world was finished. The rest was only waiting. He kept feeding the other pigeons, kept walking his precise routes, kept counting in threes and washing his hands. But the light had gone out. The man who'd given the world electricity, who'd illuminated cities and powered civilization, now shuffled through Manhattan parks, scattering seed for birds, while the world he'd created hummed around him, powered by his inventions, lit by his patents, connected by his principles. And every light, every motor, every wireless transmission was a monument to genius that had burned so bright it consumed itself, leaving only an old man, alone in a park, feeding pigeons, waiting for the end. On July 10th, 1931, Time magazine put 75-year-old Nikola Tesla on its cover. The illustration showed him surrounded by electrical coils and lightning bolts, looking stern and prophetic. Inside, the magazine called him the man who harnessed Niagara Falls, the inventor who made radio possible, the genius who gave the world alternating current. It was recognition, but it arrived decades too late and with a bitterness Tesla couldn't hide. They credit Marconi with radio, he told the reporters who gathered for his birthday. I invented it. They credit Edison with the modern electrical system. It's my polyphase current that powers their homes. Everything they attribute to others, I did first. The celebration felt less like vindication and more like eulogy. The world was acknowledging him the way you acknowledge the dead, with safe distance and sanitized praise. Tesla used his birthday press conferences to make increasingly grandiose claims. At 77, he announced he'd perfected a death ray, a particle beam weapon that could destroy armies at 200 miles, bring down fleets of aircraft, disintegrate anything in its path. He offered it to the League of Nations for world peace, suggested that if every nation possessed such a weapon, mutual assured destruction would prevent all wars. The newspapers reported it with barely concealed mockery, the aging inventor's latest fantasy, proof that genius, when it outlives its usefulness, turns to delusion. But the US military quietly sent engineers to interview him, just in case. In 1933, Tesla moved into room 33T7 of the New Yorker Hotel, a modest room on a high floor at 307 West 43rd Street. He would live there for the next 10 years. The hotel management knew he couldn't pay, but George Westinghouse had quietly arranged something, a fund to cover Tesla's housing. Not charity exactly, but gratitude from a man who understood what he owed. Tesla never knew about the arrangement. He believed the hotel simply tolerated him out of respect. He still fed pigeons every day, though his body was failing. In 1937, while crossing a street to reach the park, a taxi struck him, threw him to the pavement, cracked 3 ribs. Tesla refused to see a doctor, refused to go to a hospital. He dragged himself back to his hotel room and treated himself. The ribs healed badly. His back never stopped hurting. But he continued his walks, continued his rituals, continued counting in threes and avoiding round objects. His world had contracted to a single hotel room and a daily path to the park. He took meals in the hotel dining room when he could afford them. Otherwise he ate crackers and milk in his room. Hotel staff would see him late at night, standing at his window staring out at the city he'd helped electrify. The light spreading in every direction, powered by his alternating current, transmitted by his transformers, following principles he'd discovered alone in a Budapest park 50 years earlier. On January 5, 1943, Tesla placed a Do Not Disturb sign on his door. He'd been feeling unwell for days, his heart struggling, his breathing laboured. He was 86 years old and alone. No family in America, no close friends, just the hotel staff who brought him towels and ignored his eccentricities. 2 days passed. The sign remained on the door. On January 7, 1943, at approximately 10:45 in the evening, a maid finally entered room 33-312. Tesla was lying in bed, dressed in his customary suit, hands folded across his chest, as though he'd arranged himself for the final photograph. The maid touched his hand. It was cold. The man who had given humanity light had died in darkness, alone in a hotel room, owing money he'd never have, dreaming perhaps of inventions he'd never build. The hotel called the coroner, who determined the cause of death was coronary thrombosis, a blood clot in the heart. Tesla's body was removed to the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Home, and within hours the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived at the hotel. They sealed room 3327. They confiscated every document, every notebook, every scrap of paper. They declared it all matters of national security. The United States was at war, and Tesla's papers, his theories, his designs for particle beam weapons and wireless power were too dangerous to leave unguarded. The Office of Alien Property Custodian took custody of everything. Tesla had died stateless, his Yugoslav citizenship revoked, his American naturalization never completed. Legally he was an enemy alien, and his estate belonged to the government. His nephew, Sava Kosanovic, tried to claim the papers. He was denied access. The FBI appointed John G. Trump, an MIT professor and government consultant, to review every document. Trump's report concluded that Tesla's papers contained nothing of value, merely speculative theories with no practical application. They released this conclusion publicly, but kept all the documents classified, locked in government vaults, unavailable to the family, unavailable to scientists, unavailable to history. Tesla's funeral was held on January 12, 1943, at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. 2,000 people attended, but journalists noticed something strange. FBI agents outnumbered mourners, standing at every entrance, watching everyone who came to pay respects, guarding the secrets of a dead man who'd spent his final years feeding pigeons and claiming he could split the earth in half. The body was cremated, the ashes eventually sent to Belgrade, to a museum that would one day bear his name. But the papers remained in Washington, classified, sealed, the property of a government that feared what an 86-year-old inventor might have known about weapons or power or futures they weren't ready to face. Tesla died owing $7,600 to the New Yorker hotel, with $300 in cash, and ideas worth more than anyone could calculate, locked inside notebooks no one was allowed to read. The Office of Alien Property Custodian worked quickly. Within 48 hours of Tesla's death, every document in his possession had been catalogued, seized, and classified. His nephew, Sava Kosanovic, a Yugoslav diplomat living in New York, arrived at the hotel to claim his uncle's belongings and was turned away by federal agents. "Your uncle died stateless," they explained. "Technically an enemy alien. His property belongs to the United States government." Kosanovic hired lawyers, filed petitions, demanded access. The government refused. National security, they said, as though an 86-year-old man who died feeding pigeons posed a threat to the Republic. John G. Trump, a respected MIT electrical engineer, was appointed to review the documents. He spent several days examining notebooks, blueprints, letters, tens of thousands of pages documenting 50 years of experimental work. His official report was dismissive. The papers contained primarily speculative, philosophical, and promotional material. No new sound, workable principles or methods, nothing of significant value. The family could have them once the war ended, but not now. The report was declassified and released to newspapers, proof that Tesla's final years had produced nothing but fantasies. The death rays and earthquake machines and wireless power systems were merely the delusions of a deteriorating mind. What the report didn't mention was that Trump recommended keeping everything classified anyway, just in case. 2,000 people attended Tesla's funeral on January 12, 1943, at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine on Amsterdam Avenue. The massive Gothic building could hold 5,000, but most of the pews remained empty. Nobel laureates sent telegrams. The Yugoslav government sent representatives. A few old engineers who remembered him from better days came to pay respects. But the crowds that had once gathered to watch him demonstrate electricity, the journalists who'd hung on his every prediction, the investors who'd once competed for his attention, they were notably absent. The eulogy praised his contributions to electrical engineering, mentioned Niagara Falls and alternating current, carefully avoided discussing death rays or Martian communications, or the increasingly strange claims of his final decades. His body was cremated, the ashes placed in a golden sphere, and eventually sent to Belgrade, where they would rest in a museum bearing his name. A prophet honoured in his homeland, if not in the country that had used his inventions to build an empire. 6 months later, on June 21, 1943, the United States Supreme Court issued a ruling in the case of Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company versus United States. The government had been sued for patent infringement for using Marconi's radio patents during World War I without payment. Marconi's company demanded compensation. The Supreme Court reviewed the patents and determined that Guglielmo Marconi had not invented radio. Nikola Tesla had. Patents filed by Tesla in 1897 predated and superseded Marconi's claims. The court ruled that Marconi's radio work was based on 17 separate Tesla patents. The decision vindicated everything Tesla had claimed for 40 years. It proved he'd been right all along, that Marconi had built an empire on stolen foundations, that the Nobel Prize awarded to Marconi in 1909 should have gone to Tesla. The ruling came 6 months after Tesla died penniless in a hotel room, still fighting for recognition that would arrive too late to matter. And the Supreme Court issued the ruling not to honour Tesla, but to help the government avoid paying royalties to Marconi's estate. Even his vindication served someone else's profit. The pattern held beyond death. For years after the war, Tesla remained a footnote, mentioned briefly in engineering textbooks as the man who improved Edison's dynamos or who worked with Westinghouse on alternating current. But slowly, quietly, his reputation began to shift. Engineers studying his patents realized how far ahead of his time he'd been. The wireless power transmission he'd proposed became the foundation of radio, telecommunications, and eventually radar. His particle beam weapon became microwave technology. His oscillators and resonance theories revolutionized mechanical engineering. In 1956, on the centennial of his birth, the international scientific community established the Tesla as the unit of magnetic flux density, officially writing his name into the language of physics. Textbooks began acknowledging his contributions more fully. By the 1960s, electrical engineering students learned the Tesla coil, the Tesla transformer, the polyphase system that powered modern civilization. His predictions about wireless communication, about renewable energy, about automation, began coming true one by one, proving that what seemed like madness in 1920 was simply 2020 arriving early. The papers seized by the FBI were eventually returned to his family in 1950. Sava Kosanovic brought them to Belgrade, where they formed the core collection of the Tesla Museum. Researchers began studying them, discovering designs for technologies that wouldn't be developed for decades. But by then the narrative had calcified. Tesla, the tragic genius. Tesla, the mad scientist. Tesla who talked to pigeons and believed in Martians. The myths were more memorable than the mathematics, easier to sell than the truth, that he'd seen the future complete and spent his life trying to build it while the world insisted it was impossible, even as they used his inventions to prove him wrong. Every time you turn on a light, charge your phone, send a wireless message across the world, you're using Nikola Tesla's inventions. Billions of people, millions of times each day, live in the civilization Tesla built. The alternating current humming through power lines, the transformers stepping voltage up and down, the induction motors spinning in every appliance, the wireless transmission principles enabling global communication, all of it flows from patents filed by a Serbian immigrant who died owing money to a hotel. If you asked 100 people who invented alternating current, who made modern electrical civilization possible, who laid the foundations for wireless technology, most would say Edison. Some might say Marconi or Westinghouse. Almost none would say Tesla. This is the untold truth. Not that Tesla was a genius. Everyone knew that. But that we let him die in poverty feeding pigeons because his genius threatened profit. He succeeded too completely, proved that alternating current could power the world, then tore up the royalty contract that would have made him the wealthiest man in history to save the technology from Edison's direct current monopoly. He chose humanity over wealth, and humanity rewarded his choice with indifference. The tragedy isn't that he failed, it's that he succeeded, and his success without profit made him worthless to a world that measures value in dollars. Wardenclyffe could have given free electricity to every human on Earth, wireless power transmission from a single tower, eliminating the need for power lines, utility companies, meters, bills, making energy as freely available as sunlight. The mathematics worked, the physics was sound. Tesla had proven it in Colorado Springs. But free power means no profit, and no investor funds a system designed to eliminate their revenue stream. So the tower stood incomplete, blown up for scrap metal in 1917, while the world continued building the infrastructure of scarcity, running copper wires to every home, installing meters to measure every kilowatt, creating monopolies that still control energy a century later. Tesla wasn't impractical, he was inconvenient. His vision of abundance threatened an economy built on artificial scarcity. So the economy destroyed him, labelled him mad, dismissed his inventions as fantasies, then quietly used those inventions to build the modern world. Every wireless device proves he was right about transmission without wires. Every renewable energy system validates his focus on harnessing natural forces. Every technology we celebrate as revolutionary is built on principles he documented in patents filed over a century ago. The Serbian immigrant who arrived in America with 4 cents gave us the 20th century and asked nothing in return. So we gave him nothing in return, except perhaps the only thing that mattered to him, the knowledge that he was right, even if no one would listen, even if it killed him. He was right. Nikola Tesla died alone in a New York hotel room, owing money, clutching dreams, in a world that had forgotten to thank him for every light that shines, every motor that turns, every signal sent wirelessly through air that once seemed empty. But the lights stay on, the motors keep spinning, the signals keep transmitting, built on foundations he laid, powered by principles he discovered, proving every day that genius doesn't require recognition to change. The world. That was his victory and his tragedy. The current still flows, alternating at 60 cycles per second, exactly as he designed it in a park in Budapest, watching the sunset, seeing the complete future in a single perfect moment, and spending the rest of his life trying to give it away.